When you boot up the game for Hitman Contracts, the very first cutscene presents you with ominous TV static that flickers until it settles on a strange demonstrative video for a handgun. Seemingly innocent, yet slowly capturing your attention, what you don't realize on your first viewing is that it's setting up the brooding tone for the entire game before you've even reached the title screen. To this day, it still stands out to me as one of the most brilliant ways to introduce a character. If you're yet to witness this for yourself, I'll let the rest of it play out for you now.
This results in a rapid expansion of gas within the chamber, which forces the bullet forward and ejects its casing. This energy also produces a brief muzzle flash and a sharp
This short introduction brings such a powerful atmosphere that I can't recall a single time I've ever really skipped it. It draws you in with its strange presentation, then shocks you with gunfire and distressing screams. And to add further to the shock factor, we're introduced to the notorious assassin on the very edge of death, telling us that these horrific events we just heard were real. Whether you're familiar with 47 or not at this point, it's hard to deny the gripping nature of this opening sequence. And while Hitman Contracts doesn't exactly have much of a storyline, this striking beginning still very much plays into the later stage of the game. As 47 is now left breathing what may well be his last few breaths, his fractured body and mind soon spirals into hallucinations of his dark past. This is the brilliance of the darker themes within Hitman Contracts, and its tone echoes everything I could personally hope for in terms of a gritty and psychological, standalone Hitman story. As an avid watcher of dark thriller films, it's no surprise that this game struck so well with me, as with many others I imagine. In this video, I'm going to showcase some of the darkest themes this game has to offer, from its world design and brooding atmosphere to its psychological elements and cinematic tone, and why it makes Hitman Contracts my favourite game in the series. And despite the later half of the game being a rehash of old levels from the first game in the series, IO Interactive still managed to put together something that, as a whole, really stands well on its own. For Contracts just seems to tap into something that none of the other games have managed to achieve, or even dared to try. It doesn't focus on the overarching story to connect itself too securely into the series, and instead acts as a reimagining of his dark, troubled past. The whole game is like being trapped inside 47's mind as he recalls some of the most unsettling, and quite frankly, best missions he's ever had to fulfill. And as the game quickly shifts into its first flashback, it leaves those unfamiliar with his past only questioning as to what's unfolding, as we dive into the now, unconscious mind of 47. Upon walking through the door into 47's mind, we're greeted with visions of long, blood-smothered hallways, an abundance of familiar-looking corpses, and an atmosphere similar to that of a prison. Quickly we learn this is no ordinary asylum, but more an experimental laboratory, filled with tanks of clones, strange testing equipment, roaming patients clearly driven to madness, and a general unsettling presence. The lighting also really sets in a haunting tone, keeping everything in low ambient light, and many of the fixtures even flickering away as a result of the massacre shootout. In contrast, of course, to the blinding light we were first struck with, before walking through the door. Playing this through for the first time back in 2004, it's no surprise why some people may have barely made it past this mission alone. It echoes pure horror, unlike anything from the previous 2 Hitman games in the series at the time. Even the sounds that beckon through the halls get under your skin, of drawn-out groaning, screeching strings, and a soundtrack that buries itself into your own psyche. This whole horrific sequence, likely a nightmare caused from 47's near-death unconscious state of mind and the trauma of his troubled past, really helps set in an unnerving atmosphere that chills you to the bone. There's even depictions of torture, where one of the patients can be found hacking away at one of the clones with a knife, as the clone lies unresponsive on the bed, possibly a visual representation of 47's pain, as he himself lies helplessly on the floor, bleeding out in his hotel room. Upon diving deeper into this nightmare, you'll find blood-filled washrooms, disturbing pictures hung up in various rooms, small cells filled with patients still locked in, and a foreboding-looking operating theatre. But the gruesome nature in which it's been left screams out more like a torture chamber. What's amazing about this level is how easily you can miss all of this detail. Your objective is to simply escape the asylum, yet if you stay a little while, you'll start to realize just how deep this rabbit hole goes. It's unmistakable how much of a troubling experience 47 really had as a subject at the asylum, and how much it's clearly scarred his mind. Even the current patients are driven to the extremes of suicide through their madness. Or perhaps these are just projections of 47's current state of mind. The asylum, of course, was a complete cover-up in the end, to allow the doctors here to experiment with genetic cloning in creating the ultimate killing machine. This experiment clearly being a complete success, as proven by 47's survival in the aftermath of his wrath, upon killing the many trained clones that stood in his way as he navigated the asylum. And yet, while being the most successful subject produced from the asylum, 47 still managed to make a simple mistake and let his guard down, that could ultimately end in his death. As we resurface into the hotel room where 47 still bleeds out, we find him with just enough energy to make his way to the sink to clean himself up. But before his mind becomes too stable, we're dragged right back into the hallucinogenic nightmare, revisiting one of 47's most graphic memories to date, containing elements that only the darkest of thoughts could conjure up. By far the bloodiest and most gruesome scenes you'll find in any Hitman level to date, aptly named the Meat King's Party. Within the slaughterhouse you'll find ongoing meat production showcased in a disgustful manner, with freshly gutted carcasses drifting past hung up on meat hooks that look almost mauled by a beast. Blood pools fill the floors of almost every room you go in, draining out from the strung up dead animals as they're left to bleed out. Likely exaggerated even further by 47's current near-death condition, and the walls throughout the building draped in even more blood, with buckets next to them filled with animal limbs, possibly used to paint the blood around. The party itself is full of vulgar sex acts and the use of drugs, celebrating the fact that the Meat King got away with kidnapping a young girl. The fate of the girl being the most monstrous part of this hellscape. For in the upper half of the slaughterhouse, you'll find a room lit by candlelight. A striking change in tone from the rest of the building that fills you with a sense of evil despite its warmer ambience. Blood trails on the floor lead you to a door covered in bloodied handprints, and behind the door lies the true horror of this slaughterhouse. A scene that seems almost straight out of a serial killer film. Here we find the kidnapped girl strung up just like another piece of animal meat in the slaughterhouse, already dead, wrapped in a bloodied sheet, and murdered by the brother of the Meat King, who dances and thrusts distastefully before a shrine of her picture. Wearing very little, he still holds the meat cleaver in which he used to cut off her arm, that now lies in the thick pool of blood throughout the room. Looking up, we can see the pouring rain streaming down the skylights above, lit every so often by the lightning, and air fresheners hanging down from the ceiling that surround the room, a very appropriate reference to a scene in the film Seven, where the discovery of a body is in a room filled with air fresheners just like this. And just as the word sloth is written on the walls in this scene, the word bitch is written in red on the picture of the girl's portrait above the shrine. Looking closer at the shrine, you'll see the girl's eyes have been scratched out of the pictures, telling us that her eyes were gouged out by the monstrous killer, leaving black holes where her eyes once were, and streaks of blood running down her forehead and into her hair. Significant bruising also shows on her neck, indicating she was possibly strangled as part of her torture before her death, likely a result of her struggling to get free as she was raped while being bound to one of the two horrific fixtures within the room. This theme of torture is found throughout the game on many of the levels, and again is no doubt tied to the real-life pain and emotions 47 feels in his current state. You can also hear laughter coming from the girl in this room, as if her presence is still around even after death, but in truth, it's just more of 47's mind playing tricks on him, as the laughter is coming from a building across the street from the hotel where 47 currently is in the real world. As with the previous two flashbacks, the game does a great job of linking up each forthcoming mission with hallucinations that transform into the memory. The next memory being that of the snow job in Siberia. A brighter, more open, and much more tamer mission compared to the previous two. Its brighter mood brought on, of course, by the presence of snow in this level, yet it's still under the mask of night, a common running theme you'll notice with all the levels now. That, combined with rainfall in each level, depict the guilt that 47 feels for his murderous past work with the ICA. The rainfall in this level replaced with snow, as it bears colder temperatures. You won't find blood-skewed buildings or piles of corpses in this cold wasteland, however. Instead, you'll find more pronounced ambience, with empty and low-lit roads at the edge of the map, a long, harrowing underground tunnel, a watchtower overlooking the snow-ridden harbour, warmly lit soldier barracks with a mountainous backdrop, and a half-sunken submarine on a frozen ice plain. While this level doesn't scream dark tones or horror, you're still left with a slight unease, feeling like all eyes are upon you as you navigate the hazy, blizzard-filled wastes. A similar feeling I'd suspect the characters would have in the film adaptation of The Thing, which this level clearly breathes similar in tone to. So much so that one of your targets, Fabian Fuchs, shares the name and bears a similar appearance to that of the character Fuchs in the film, another clever and subtle reference that the developers make to dark cinema. The openness of this level is a welcome change from the previous two, yet you can't help but feel it's quite empty, and while its sparseness lends itself to a very lonely and cold atmosphere, only enhanced by the strong blizzard and clouds of snow powder drifting in the air, it lacks any psychological aspects that the first two flashbacks lean so nicely into. But thankfully the ties between 47's mind and reality don't completely come to a halt, for as the police start to look for 47 after his failed assassination, and he's bound to his room, wounded, like a sitting duck, waiting for them to gun him down, 47 recalls back to another memory, similar in nature. Beldingford Manor, home to Winston Beldingford. Clearly a fan of game hunting as shown by the various mounted animal heads strewn across the manor walls. We find him currently in the midst of hosting a hunting party, along with his son Alistair. But it's not your usual hunting party, as Winston seems to seek the thrill of a bigger chase. Something more forbidden, much more evil, and a slight parody of Richard Connell's 1924 short story, The Most Dangerous Game. That forbidden chase being Oxford champion track runner Giles Northcott, who's been kidnapped, beaten, locked up in the stables, and left to sleep alongside the horses in the hay. And come morning, he'll be let loose only to be chased down by Winston and his various hunting companions. While it's possible this is the actual memory of the contract, you can't deny it bears a similar resemblance to that of the situation 47 currently finds himself in. Beaten, stuck lifeless in a cage, waiting for the hunting party to arrive, where 47 will be forced to either outrun the party or take them head-on in any way he can with his deadly skill set, making 47 clearly the most dangerous game of all in this case. But human game hunting isn't the only dark thrill that Winston acts upon, for he also has a deep sexual lust for the maids he employs, with quite the track record for firing and hiring new maids to fulfill his current desires, and he seems to succeed quite well in bedding the maids, even sharing his bed with one during the contract. Yet he also finds pleasure in spying on them often, sporting a secret passage that connects to his bedroom, and leads to a two-way mirror that peers into the bathroom that the maids will frequently wash in. Clearly Winston has grown bored in his older age since being a celebrated hunter during his youth, and now lusts for such pleasure, as well as the thrill of human game. Strangely, this whole contract is shrouded by a haunting exterior to the level, with mist-covered waters that you arrive by, dirt pathways lined with dying trees next to them, and a garden maze to add to the mystique. It gives off a strange, deathly or ghostly appearance to the surroundings, enhanced more so by the reoccurring night and rainfall that we've become so accustomed to by this point. While inside the manor, there is but one single painting that separates itself from the others around the manor, when if shot with a gun, the bullet holes will turn red, as if the painting itself is alive in some way, and only adding to the haunting nature of this level. One of the more recent Hitman games even makes a reference to it in this way, when some mansion staff in Sapienza are caught talking about films and they mention a horror called The Haunting of Beldingford Manor. This whole theme of human game hunting, mixed with its haunting and deathly backdrop, perhaps hinting towards the fate that 47 will soon fall into, as he struggles to grasp onto any sign of life through his painful mistake. Even his help gets cut short by the approaching hunting party out for his head. His next flashback takes us to Rotterdam, and while this location breathes a lot of the similar aspects from the previous missions, with its dark, dimly lit atmosphere, involvements of crime, and themes of sex, drugs, and torture, I can't help but feel that it's more of just a bridge between the gap, to connect it to the mission afterwards, also placed in Rotterdam, Deadly Cargo, the first of the 6 remastered missions from Codename 47, the first game in the Hitman series. By connecting the mission in this manner, the game doesn't need to cut back to 47's story at the present time, and instead simply starts the next mission at the completion of this one, without a cutscene to introduce it. This is sadly one of the few downfalls to the game for me, as the start does such a great job of connecting each mission into the cutscenes, helping build upon the current situation of 47, while also psychologically linking up a flashback, that within it also breathes aspects of his current pain and suffering. Out of the remaining 6 flashback missions, only 2 of them are introduced with cutscenes. It makes sense, of course, that these missions were lined up this way, as to not need a cutscene between them, with 2 placed in Rotterdam and 4 placed in China, all grouped together. Perhaps an obvious trait of the time constraints that the developers had at the time while making the game, with only about a 7-month window in which to complete it, and clearly having an effect on the finished product. Yet I can't help but wonder what could have been if they were allowed a further few months to develop it, how much further they could have really pushed the themes of death within a few more original flashback missions, and perhaps even been able to expand on the mental effects this would have on 47 after his awakening in the hotel. That's not to say that these remasters aren't great reimaginings of some actual past contracts that we've come to know and love from previously in the series. There is one remastered level, possibly one of the most praised missions in the series, that introduces a very dark and sinister element, something not present in the original mission, Traditions of the Trade. This seemingly quiet and peaceful 3-story hotel holds a dark secret found hidden away on the ground floor, completely unrelated to the mission's contract at hand. For in the East Wing, located behind a locked door, you'll be welcomed, or more rather swept cold by the sudden change in tone, from the hotel's warm orange glow to a dark, desaturated blue. The windows that line the corridor here all blowing in a draft, causing the ghostly-looking curtains to flaunt about in the breeze, and the constant rain outside to flood the carpets with darkened, damp patches. The plant life that once stood in the corners have strangely perished in the otherworldly conditions, leaving the floor surrounding them covered in dead leaves. Making our way to the end of the corridor, you'll find bloodstains that suggest they lead towards the exiting double doors on the other side of the corridor, and as we exit through the doors, we discover the trail only continues with a much more concerning amount of blood. The trail leads to room 109, guarded by one of the hotel security staff, where behind him shows the brutal display of what seems to have been a murder. Exploring inside room 109, the corpse of just one individual lies dead on the floor, with a blood trail leading off towards the bathroom. A bloody kitchen knife is also impaled into the wall next to him, the bed behind him filled with a pool of blood, and further blood covering the walls above the bed, all perhaps showing signs of a struggle. But that's not even the least of the blood that's been drawn in this horrific scene, for as you look towards the bathroom, you'll find the worst of it all. The remains of what can only be described as a literal bloodbath, still running fresh down the drain, and an unexplained sawn-off shotgun left on the ground. It's unclear what really happened here, but there's certainly more than meets the eye. For at the entrance of the room, the blood trails seem to suggest that they exit the room, rather than enter, and following the blood trails brings us back to where we began, in the cold, otherworldly corridor, and leaves us standing in front of room 108 now. Peering through the keyhole, you'll see another security guard of the hotel, undressed for the shower, and gesturing towards the mirror in the bathroom. And rightly so, for what he sees in the mirror is the very ghost of the murdered guest from room 109, now haunting the hotel. And the fact that the security guard is making use of a room clearly marked off from public use seems to suggest that he is possibly responsible for the guest's murder. How or why this came about is unclear, but it's without doubt one of the darkest and most puzzling features within Hitman contracts, for it never happened within the original version of the mission. This could suggest that 47's memory has been slightly skewed by his current situation, and is perhaps visualizing a representation of his own death, gunned down in a bloody execution, within the very hotel room he currently finds himself in.
This room, this bullet, there's a bullet for everyone, and a time and a place.
This harrowing beginning to the end of Hitman contracts brings us back into the current mind of 47, no longer revisiting his troubled memories. Soon, the hordes of SWAT police forces will make their way into the hotel to put an end to 47. Yet perhaps he saw this coming all along, as foretold in the first flashback he had, where perhaps in that moment, his fear of being hunted down crossed over into his mind so much that his coping mechanism was to reimagine his daring escape he had once achieved at the asylum, where similarly, hordes of SWAT teams made their best attempt to put 47 down after his bloody wrath. This final level, of course, being the only level in the game that isn't raining in some form, separates it visually to the rest of the flashbacks in the game. Perhaps even a statement to show 47 is back in control. No longer afraid of death. No longer plagued by the guilt he felt. No longer suffering in pain as he bled out and crept the closest to death he had ever been. No longer feeling stuck and caged in like a wounded animal, waiting for the hunters to sniff him out and end his life. As now, 47 being conscious and of sound mind again, fear seems no longer a factor for him. As he prepares himself with guns in hand to finish what he started.